Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly Podcast. Today I'm joined by a relatively new YouTuber, The Endeavor. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Todd.
Oh, sure. So we're today going to discuss the importance of Christian morals and values to preserving the civilization. So why don't we open up with some of your thoughts on that?
Well, what I often talk about is building a strong civilization. So I'm a reactionary. What my focus is on building a strong, sustainable civilization. And Christianity is a powerful civilizational force. It gives people a structure to live by. It gives them an ethos. It gives them purpose, and it directs people towards healthy civilizational lifestyles. So big families, strong family values, uh, strong fathers, good mothers. It really directs people toward it really helps create a stronger civilization. And the modern secular liberal civilization has none of that, and it's created a much weaker civilization.
Yeah, I would agree on that on pretty much all the points. One of the things I think where this is most easily seen is the low TFR rates of European women. It's like averaging, it's probably slightly below replacement level for all of Europe. I think Pat Buchanan once wrote in Death of the West that outside of Albania, not a single European country has a replacement birth rate. And of course, that is directly correlated to the migrant crisis, which if European women had maintained the pre-World War I TFR rates of 7 children per woman, this wouldn't even be a problem.
Yes, exactly. And actually, it for a lot of these countries, it's not only slightly below; it's far below. And a civilization can only live if it has people. And if you can't replace your people, you're not going to have a civilization. And what I really think though that the real problem with that's just the biggest problem with secularism is that people don't have children and they can't sustain a civilization like that.
Well, yeah, you point, if secularization takes hold and people believe the universe is meaningless and they fall into nihilism and despair. I mean, if you have nothing to live for, then you have nothing to die for. So why would you take any risks of having children or defending your nation or building a foundation for the future? Because you're not going to be here 200 years from now. So
Yeah.
let me give you an example of the difference in outlook and why this is so brutal. Is I forget which university in England it was, but I heard this anecdote from some people that were advocating classical education. And they said there was this, old university. It was running down, the particular college, right? So in England, there'll be like universities and there's colleges attached to them. And this one college was running down. And walking up to the college, you see this pathway flanked by, beautifully manicured trees that were, kept up by the gardener and to look really nice. And so they found the plans for this college, and they looked at how it was built and what they would need to replace to get it functional again. And they realized that the kind of wood that was used in the construction from the blueprints, which they had in the archives, this was they didn't have it available. They didn't know where they could find it. Now this college was probably built sometime in the late Middle Ages. And then one of the guys is looking at the blueprint, and they find on the margin something about the trees that had flanked the avenue up to the college. And they read that they were planted there centuries ago so that they could be cut down to replace the rotted out timbers in the college, because they knew that would happen at some point.
Yes.
That is the kind of thinking that is absolutely foreign to modern man, and why he will go up in a puff of smoke.
Exactly, because they realized that they were part of something bigger. So this university, I've never heard the story before, but it's an interesting story. This university, they were thinking ahead. They weren't only thinking about the next 5 years; they were thinking about the next 100 years, next 200 years, and that's just how civilizations are built. And because the individual in a civilization needs to have the sense that they're part of something bigger than themselves. That's what will get people to actually make the necessary sacrifices to build a stronger civilization. And Christianity gives people that. It gave the Europeans that for thousands of years. And the problem with just modern secular society is that it's all individualistic. So pretty much everyone's just thinking about themselves. They're thinking about, well, what would my next paycheck be? How much porn can I watch and all this other stuff.
What is the next Super Bowl game?
Yeah, exactly. And there's no sense that like you're part of something bigger than yourselves, and this is why people are allowing their countries to be taken over by Islamic migrants, because they don't see any value in the land that they inhabit. They don't see themselves as part of a nation.
Well, there's another also interesting corollary to all this as well, is that in the United States, well, we're not in the same imminent risk of migrants, because the Latin American migrants are mostly located in the Southwest. So the entire nation is not itself necessarily at risk. But one of the things that we do see, and this is something that we don't see amongst, say, our libertarian friends, is connecting the dots, is the sort of pathological sexual behavior and broken families that, as Charles Murray has recorded in Coming Apart, not just minority families, but even white families. We have these lawless, feral kids that grow up with single moms and no stable male authority figure to lead them and teach them. They end up becoming these sort of internal predatory force that undermines society, which is also one of the chief, quote, problems that the state is, quote, trying to solve, saying, oh, you can't let these kids starve. Well, no, you can't. But the way you solve it is you force men to take responsibility and women to stop being whores. But the point is, the libertarians don't get the connection that government becomes more tyrannical if people can't govern themselves. And, of course, this sort of loose sexual morality is, of course, leading to a state of ungovernability. At some point, even the government can't govern it. And then we go into anarchy.
Yeah, my problem with libertarianism is that I feel that it gets wrong what the purpose of a state should be. You see, they seem to think that the purpose of a state is to protect individual rights, but for me, like that seems to be an idea born out of decadence, really. When the real purpose of a civilization is to sustain itself and to perpetuate itself and to create really create a civilization that's powerful. And when your main focus is on, well, my individual right for this, my individual right for that, and there's nothing that's being given up for the civilization itself. That's when you get.
You still there? You kind of cut out.
Oh, hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you cut out for a moment.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, what I said was that the problem with libertarianism is that it assumes that the purpose of a state is individual rights, when I believe that the purpose of a state is sustainability. The purpose of a civilization is to perpetuate itself. And one that's purely focused on individual rights will essentially result in people not making the necessary sacrifices to build a stronger civilization.
Well, one of the things that we see with all modern ideology, and this is interesting, it's all essentially egotistical and selfish, right? We look at the libertarians, and it's just fairly self-evident. I mean, just look at their philosophy. But even on the left, where we tend to associate it with collectivism, well, yes, there is that element to it, but the core element is what? To actualize the individual, right? The anarchists and the communists will say, well, look, if you don't have guaranteed rights to income, food, and clothing, how can you be satisfied? Which is really just a logical extension of the guaranteed rights of property, self-ownership. I mean, if you need those to flourish, well, then you obviously need food, clothes, and shelter as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I do feel like this is kind of a result of materialism, and that's why Christianity is a powerful tool, powerful civilizational tool, because people aren't only focused on, well, their physiological needs, their individual needs. They're actually focused on contributing to something more than themselves.
Yeah, no, exactly. Now, one of the other things too that we see that Christianity aids in the building up of a society is in the West, where Christianity had its longest heritage, is its contribution to scientific development. One I think constructive theory is the professor Lynn White, the historical root of our ecological crisis. He was a medieval scholar and an environmentalist, but he argued that it was the Christian outlook of the demystification of nature that allowed for the development of scientific thinking. And we've got, modern scholarship like Rodney Stark as well, The Triumph of Reason, which also connect the Christian values, Christian concepts. Right, the Catholic Church gave us the university system, which developed into. So, those nations that are, pagan or Islamic have all lagged massively behind the West, where at times they, at one point, were ahead. I mean, China and the Caliphate during the Middle Ages were arguably more advanced than the West, but now it's not the case at all. It's the other way around.
Yes, and what I will say is that it's a mistake for people to blame Islam for everything, because you have to understand that Christian Europe never allowed for mass Islamic migration, and I mean Islam hasn't changed since a century ago. So really, the problem is that Islam is a more powerful.
Well, yeah, Islam is more powerful than secularism, because you can't fight something with nothing.
I seem to be having network trouble. Can you hear me right now?
Yeah, I can hear you, but you did cut out.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, what I was saying was that Islam it's a more powerful civilizational force, because it gives their people an ethos. It gives them a purpose. They're hyper masculine. They have large families, and they have a strong in-group preference. And if you have a force of people that are functioning like this, they're going to beat a nihilistic, individualistic, secular population eventually. Sooner or later, it's going to be the Muslims that end up winning, because they're doing what they're doing is actually building a civilization, unlike the West, which is just letting theirs die.
Well, exactly. This is like, the secularists, whether they like it or not, there's a spiritual component to reality, and they're ignoring it is not going to help them survive Islam. So you can't beat something with nothing. Oh, one of the strategies that people learn in military history and stuff is that you attack the enemy where he's weakest or where he isn't present. So let me give you an example. Right, everybody thought the Ardennes was impassable to tanks. And in 1940, the Germans send their tanks through to attack it. And in the 1750s, when the British were fighting the French in Quebec, they thought the cliffs that Quebec overlooked were unscalable, but the British scaled it, surprised the French, and defeated them. So you attack the enemy where he's not only absent, but where he doesn't even think there's a battlefront. Well, that's what Islam has been doing. They've been attacking Western man spiritually, because there's no spirit to upgird Western man. It was killed.
Exactly. Because what you'll often hear is a lot of these a lot of the globalist types, or even like maybe a lot of these like centrist types, or even some neocons, is they seem to believe that all you need to do is just bring in the Muslims from the third world. They'll become these secular, liberal, individualists, just with the right education and stuff like that. It's complete nonsense, because you offer them absolutely nothing, because the Western society modern Western society goes completely against their beliefs, and they don't want to take part in secular culture. And frankly, I don't blame them, because I don't either. So, I mean, they're not going to give up their Islam, their faith, for something and just so empty. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, it isn't, and we are thankfully seeing this trend as well, beginning in Christian groups throughout Europe and North America. North America, Christianity is more entrenched and is more likely to make a powerful comeback. But even in Europe, we're seeing this as well, not just in the obvious cases of Poland and Hungary, who wrote into their constitutions that their national origin is in Christianity. But also we see this in population groups in Holland and France, where they're higher than the national average TFRs are going to give them historical leverage. But it is interesting that the nations in Europe that have done the best, that are the most successful at stemming the impending tide of the migrant crisis, are those that self-consciously identify as Christians, Poland and Hungary.
Yeah, well, what I say to that, what I say is because I feel that that Christianity gives you a more of an appreciation for the civilization that you inhabit. It really gets to see you see your nation as something as more of a community, as more of something of value. Whereas in the secular ones, they don't really see their countries as a community at all. Really, it's just kind of a plot of land with a government that they happen to live in, and that's why they're just allowing it to wither away.
Yeah, in many ways, while the Hobbesian war of all against all and the state of nature has never actually really existed, but because they believe it has existed, their own political philosophy is actually converging on this Hobbesian war of all against all. And you see, one of the things that makes Christianity so powerful as a social force is that it offers not only, I mean, all religions claim to offer something, but what it offers is what no other religion does offer, because it sort of lessens the hard edge of living with people. So like in ancient Rome, infanticide and abortion was normal, and exposure of children. If you were exposed, you would either die of exposure or become a slave. And the Christians said, no, that's completely barbaric and insane. You can't do that. So before they had political power, they rescued those orphans. And then after they had political power, they outlawed the practice. I mean, nobody today would honestly want to go back to that, where orphans are just abandoned in the street to die and picking up by slavers. Well, maybe libertarians. But I mean, who really wants to live in a society that's not informed by those values? Or like the idea of pagans of like killing twins and stuff, like in the Igbo and Nigeria. They thought it was a curse, so they would just kill the twins. Just absurd, but that's how they looked at it, And all of these things that we take for granted that are just like civilized and humane and normal, cannibalism, slavery, all of that was outlawed by the British, and the Christians.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the secular people are bringing it back. We're reverting back to our pagan instincts of infanticide, abortion. There's even talk of normalizing cannibalism. Recently, there was I forget where the article was.
It was Richard Dawkins that said.
Well, yeah, they're creating synthetic meat, and he said we should create synthetic human flesh to destigmatize cannibalism. Great. So we're going back to ancient Rome, where people bleed in the Colosseum, are crucified, and you eat people. Awesome. How is that going to do anything?
Well, what I will say is that I think that what really kind of caused people to lose their faith, unfortunately, it was decadence, really, because most people in the West were Christian up until like, say, World War II. And think about all the wars and stuff like that. 30 Years' War, and all these other wars, and they held on to their faith throughout that. Through thick and thin, but once it came to once the point came when it's like, oh well, I can either do this or I can watch porn and smoke weed and sit at home playing video games instead. Well, that's what really got people to lose their faith. Unfortunately, it was decadence. And what I say though is the problem with that is we're so used to a decadent society that pretty much all of our physiological needs are accounted for, that we've really lost track of actually having a society that you can sustain. because like we said earlier, I mean, birth rates are below replacement, which in some of these countries it's like 0.5% below replacement. I mean, you're not going to have a civilization for very long.
Well, exactly. And, this is why one of my pet peeves about science fiction is if everybody's atheist in science fiction, how come you have human populations in the year, 3000 or 40,000 AD? I mean, you wouldn't, because they just wouldn't replace.
Yeah.
But there's another thing, too, about Christianity is looking at the secular world. I mean, its culture is just, it sucks. I mean, compare what we've produced in the past century in literature to, Dante's Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost, and Tolstoy's War and Peace. I mean, do you have anything even remotely in that ballpark?
No, we don't. One correction I'll make. What I said 5%. The birth rate in a lot of these countries is like half a child less than replacement, sometimes even more, meaning that because what a civilization needs is a 2.1 births per woman to replace its population. Some of these countries it's like 1.4. It's ridiculous,
Oh yeah. And also remember when the Enlightenment was offered to us, to mankind in Europe, what was the offer? Well, it would be utopia. It would abolish racism, classism, poverty, want, hatred, sexism, and it's, if anything, aggravated all of the things that it said it was going to stop. Marx famously said that, in communism, when a man could fish in the morning and read a book in the afternoon and do it all again the next day. But the thing is, human creativity is tanked. I mean, we went from Mozart to Madonna. I mean, this is clearly degeneration. Anybody who thinks otherwise should probably have their head examined.
Oh, absolutely. Like I can't think of any real cultural masterpieces built in the last century, really. I mean there's there's a lot of good movies and stuff, but I mean none of it's ever going to compare to never going to compare to the Sistine Chapel. It's never going to compare to the Mona Lisa or any of this stuff, or hell, even something like even in 19th century work, like you mentioned, War and Peace or Les Miserables, or all these other works. We don't have that anymore,
No, we don't, because these people are incapable of producing it. They live in this self-imposed prison. I mean, basically they're the guys living in the cave, and we've exited Plato's cave and are trying to tell them about the sun, the birds, and all that stuff, and they're getting mad and they try to kill us.
Yeah, and what I'll say is, you said earlier about the Enlightenment. I'm actually, my upcoming videos will be talking about some of these ideas because I feel that a lot of these the complaints of the Enlightenment, class struggle and all this other stuff. I mean, I know that was Marx. That was a bit later. And then even modern complaints racism and sexism and all this stuff. Well, I think the real problem is that a lot of these things are really just human results of human nature rather than, the result of these evil, oppressive forces. I really think that a lot of the complaints in modern society and the things we view as evil, I mean, a lot of them are just human nature. Whereas, and I do feel that going back to Christianity, it really has a way of curbing human nature to make humans to make humans for the better. So, for example, like you said earlier, they might have engaged in things like cannibalism, and infanticide and all this other stuff. Well, I think having a system there that tells you, you probably shouldn't engage in that. Having that system there, that actually is useful. But the problem is, in the modern day, the belief is that it's the system that makes people bad, and if we remove the system, then they'll become good, which is it's nonsense, because
it's absurd. It's never happened.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the idea that I think it was John Locke that said that John Locke, or I can't remember who it was, but they had said that man in nature was this like peace-loving being. Where
Yeah. Yeah, in the state of nature. Yeah, at least Hobbes was closer, man.
yeah, Hobbes was a lot right, closer about that. He said like, in man in the state of nature was horrible.
Which he is. I mean, for all these anarchists and libertarians, go to any failed state of your choice. Afghanistan, Mexico, Somalia. Tell me how it's working out for those people.
Yeah, because I think that one of the real problems is that we have the idea today that institutions are what makes man evil, and if we take away the institutions, we take away the restrictions they place on them, we take away like the various rules they've set out, that's what's going to make man good. Whereas in reality, what I think is that man is in nature is really quite horrible, and it's the structure he has in his life, the institutions, the communities he has, that's what makes him good.
Yeah, I mean, man is evil and prone to wickedness, and institutions and human relationships are the only things that work on him, and grace, that work on him to make him not a terrible person.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Because, what you'll often hear is the argument from either atheists or maybe some libertarians and stuff like that, is that, they'll say, well, look at all this stuff that Christianity did in the past. Like, oh, well, what about like the Inquisition, or what about the Crusades and all this other stuff, or what about? And what I say is, well,
as if stopping Islamic invasion is a bad thing, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. I find it funny how many atheists seem to love Islam so much. But beside the point, what I was going to say was that I think that like I said earlier, man in nature is horrible. So is it Christianity that made him bad, or is it that he is horrible nonetheless, and Christianity made him better? That less evil. Because if you look at all these other civilizations. If you think that the West was barbaric, the Mayans gouged people's hearts out. The Polynesians ate each other.
Well, actually, that's actually a very good point, and I've made this before in other contexts. Is if we assume humans are basically bad, and then when we see Christians behaving badly, or self-proclaimed Christians, that's not the irregularity to be explained. The irregularity to be explained is, why did we set up orphanages, charities, and hospitals? Why did we educate? Why did we feed the hungry, the naked, and the poor? Who else did that? The Greeks and the Romans said, screw those people, just throw them to the wolves, literally. Why did we end cruel and why does the Constitution have, the clause about cruel and unusual punishment? Did the Romans no, they didn't care. They had gladiators and, beheadings and crucifixion. Of course, it was the Christians that outlawed crucifixion and the gladiators. There were some brutal punishments in the Middle Ages, auto da fe's and drownings and drawing and quartering. But the Christian ethos is like, hey, well, this is just what, okay, if someone has got to die, why are they dying in this brutal, painful way? Is it for some voyeuristic pleasure of the audience? No, don't do that. And of course, the United States has had that in its Constitution, which is a direct result of the Christian spirit being manifested.
Yeah, what I often say though is that you can't really judge people when torture and all these wars, all these massacres in the past, because you have to understand that they didn't have the level of physiological how do I say this? They didn't have the wealth that we had. So they didn't have the technology and all this stuff. Life was a lot more brutal for them back then. And they had to do these things, and they had to, be more vicious in order to actually sustain their civilization. And that's the problem, is really that there's the narrative today is that we were vicious back then, but now we've progressed to be these enlightened, liberal, secular people. And I think it's just not true. I think that technology really has kind of allowed us to not be as violent with each other, but it's gotten to the point where we're now reckless with the level of decadence we have.
Well, I would argue the absurdity of that claim is self-refuted by 2 world wars and all of the bloody sort of brush fire wars during the Cold War. I mean, it was just a a bloodbath in the literal sense. Far more people died per capita, now in those wars than you've got civil wars that are still ongoing, like Lebanon and Syria, where hundreds of thousands of people are dying. I mean, it's really what we've done. We've externalized the violence. It's not as much internal. But I would also make one challenge you on one point here. Well, certainly the ease with which embracing these values is facilitated by material conditions. I don't really think material conditions are an extremely relevant factor, because let's look at the Roman Empire, right? So the material conditions don't really change before and after Constantine. And yet the Christians ended up stopping infanticide, stopping, the enslaving of orphans, ending the cruel and unusual punishment of gladiators or crucifixion, and stopping the gladiatorial games. You see, this is where I think the sort of external material explanation falls, because, okay, if these things only really change due to material conditions, well, there's no change in the material conditions of the Roman Empire when they had these moral changes. What changed was not the material conditions, but the spiritual conditions.
Well, okay, yes, I will agree with that, but I will say, though, that material conditions do make people perhaps less violent. It does not necessarily mean they're less. It does not necessarily mean they're more moral, though. So, for example, say that in the Middle Ages, one kingdom had to go ransack another kingdom so that they could gain resources. They could bring them back, and they could survive. They needed to do it, and today we don't need to go ransack the country beside us in order to feed ourselves. However, I feel that does not necessarily mean we're more moral today. What it means is that we don't need to go to such extents to satisfy our physiological needs.
I mean, yeah, I would agree in part, but let me maybe give you another example of this. So in his biography on Julius Caesar, J.S.C. Fuller criticizes Caesar for his savage conquest of Gaul with the unnecessary level of brutality he brought to it. And then Fuller quotes Montesquieu and argues that in the realm of political, in the realm of international politics, nations should achieve their legitimate objectives as basically as not cheaply as possible. That's the wrong word, but with as little disruption to the overall status quo as possible, with full recognition of the legitimate interests of other powers. And yet, so you see this sort of oscillation between a relatively humane style of warfare where women and children are avoided. You don't go after them and kill them or enslave them and burn cities to the ground like the Romans did. And then you oscillate. And that happens roughly independently of technology. So, for example, at the end of the Middle Ages, with the end of the 30 Years' War and the massive bloodbath and all the civilians that were killed, cities leveled, farmsteads destroyed, with ever-increasing technology, more powerful weapons, people said, oh, stop it. We got to stop this. But as technology progressed even further into World War I and World War II, we reverted back to the Roman method, where we would just, bomb cities into oblivion, starve, slaughter whole populations. So the change was sort of independent of the progress of technology.
Yeah, but I mean, the point I was trying to make was that the modern notion that we've kind of advanced morally because we don't go massacre people anymore, I think is false. Because I think because I think that we've advanced technologically, but we've regressed morally. Because Oh, go ahead.
But I was just gonna say I totally agree. Mass murdering your own children is going back to the savages of Africa and the steppe.
Well, yes, but the narrative today seems to be, though, that humans have progressed to a superior morality where we don't do all these barbaric things anymore. And to me, that's complete nonsense, because I think that if you took Westerners today and put them all on this deserted island, within the second they got hungry, they'd start killing each other.
Lord of the Flies, baby.
Exactly.
I have a friend on Discord. He's been on some of my streams before. His name is Logos, and he said that he said he had an argument with a friend over Middle Ages and Christianity, and he's like, look at the crap those people. He's not a Christian himself, but he's a sympathetic fellow traveler, I guess you might say. And he was saying to his friend at work, I think it was at work, that look at the crap they had to go through. The Black Death, the Islamic invasion, the Mongol invasions, the Viking invasions, and look at how it kept the religious institutions kept Europe together. Imagine if the United States were to go through trials like that. He said we'd be at each other's throats, within a week or two.
Yeah, because I think that I don't know what's going to hold people together when all this stuff goes bad. Which, in my opinion, I think that the West is at this rate is looking at some dark days ahead. And I don't know what's going to hold people together.
I think one other thing that is important about how Christianity makes society better is, the sort of, as we've been talking about already, the nasty things that people naturally do ultimately never get stamped out entirely, but they get ameliorated, accommodated, so that there's the opportunity cost for doing it is raised to the degree that people just don't do it for fear of, transgressing that cost. One of my favorite examples is in the reduction of violence is Alfred the Great, when I think it was the Battle of Edington in 878, where he defeats Guthrum the Viking. When the Vikings defeated Anglo-Saxon kings, one of them, King Edmund of East Anglia, was tied to a tree and shot full of arrows because he wouldn't renounce his faith in Christ. So that's the fate Alfred could have expected had he lost to the Vikings. But what does he do instead? He doesn't slaughter them all. He offers terms. And the terms are that Guthrum convert to Christianity and his army, and they moved to Danelaw. And Guthrum did it and stayed loyal to Alfred throughout the rest of his life. Now, that's outstanding. I mean, the Vikings would never have done that.
Yeah.
Or the Romans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I kind of just. I think though that. I do. I think that people need the kind of that moral system, because when they don't have that, they end up doing these horrible things to each other. And just the problem with the modern notion is that we don't need a moral thing. That we seem to think that moral systems are a tool of oppression or something like that. And it couldn't be further from the truth, because without those systems, man does revert to his natural state, and he's pretty darn vicious in that state.
A good refutation of that comes from Inspiring Philosophy. I forget which one of his videos it was, but he says that the rules of Christianity, far from being oppressive, make us our true selves. And he gives an example of how, if you want to become a great athlete or a great author, you have to discipline yourself under a lot of really onerous conditions so that you can develop the skills and the attributes necessary to accomplish your objective. And if you don't go through that rigorous process of refinement, then you'll just never achieve that goal, that dream. Well, that's the thing with Christianity. By subjugating people to this, they make them able to perform at a higher level than they would otherwise be able to perform at. Yeah. Which is in part, I think, why we see the complete lethargy and failure and just disgusting weakness of the modern man. I mean, he can only dream of being, a conquistador or an explorer in a wooden boat circumnavigating the globe. I mean, he could never do that.
Yeah, I talked about that in my response to the Distributist, his series on nerd culture. I had spoken about that in my video, how really just the modern world, we have no way of recreating just the joy that people could have experienced back then. Really, just the sense of adventure. Really, so it's really quite sad.
It is, but you see, what they've done is they've handicapped themselves to the point where all they can do is is dream, if even they can do that, about the accomplishments of the past, because they are themselves physically, they're physical and mental midgets, unable to accomplish these things.
Yeah. So say is that I kind of think of Christianity as a diet for a civilization. I see it as to a civilization what a diet, a healthy diet, and good exercise is to a person. So, for example, I think secularism is kind of the result of the equivalent of a person who doesn't exercise, eats whatever they want, just watches porn every day, does drugs every day. They may have that. They have more of a. They may have more of a temporary gratification, but the reality is it's making a miserable person. And I think that Christianity versus secularism is kind of the same, because for a civilization, Christianity, yes, it puts some restrictions on people. It has a moral system. It has it's difficult to follow these rules. However, it creates bigger families, stronger men. It creates future generations, better art, and overall just more motivated people, and the civilization ends up stronger. Whereas secular civilizations, everyone's just doing whatever they can to indulge in all of their immediate desires, and sure they might, and like I said, these people in modern secular society, they have an easier kind of instant gratification, but I mean, just the civilization itself just decays.
Exactly. You mentioned weak men. A perfect example of this, comparing it to the virility of Christian men, is the expedition by Ernst Shackleton. He and his men were stranded in Antarctica for the better part of a year, waiting for the rescue fleet to get to them once the ice had thawed enough that the icebreakers could make it through. And not a single crew member was lost.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like 1916, okay? And you survived in Antarctica without any connection to the outside world. I mean, if you got like 20 men today, they'd all be dead in a week.
Oh, absolutely. With modern technology, they'd all be dead in a week.
If they couldn't be rescued for that length of time for whatever reason.
And what I well, one thing I just kind of find ironic is that if you just look at all these atheist YouTubers, they're always these like overweight neckbeards with they probably have like a My Little Pony poster or something like that. It's like, do you really think this is the kind of man who's gonna contribute to a civilization? Is this the kind of man that could have that could have gone off and fought in the Crusades? Is this the kind of man that could have gone off to colonize North America?
Yeah, I mean, try to build a homestead out in the frontier, right? I mean, and let's not just pick on the men. Can you imagine any woman today that would be capable of bearing a child in a log cabin out somewhere in the Dakotas?
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I mean, without going to a hospital to have all the. I mean, look, I'm glad the mortality rates for both mother and child are down, but look at the level of toughness even the women had to have when they went out west. I mean, they were having children in log cabins. They didn't go to the hospital, have this really sanitized, clean area to give birth to.
And you want to know the real irony though is that back then like I said, they had no like painkillers, no hospital they was in a log cabin, but they did it 6-7 times in their life, whereas women today with all this stuff they won't even do it. They'll do it maybe once, and even if that at that. I mean,
that's kind of the paradox, right? The quote liberation of women makes them weaker and more contemptible than they would have been otherwise. I mean, they make all this pablum about strong women. Well, I mean, for physical endurance and able to survive hardship, the strong women were on the frontier, not in Hollywood.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly. And why is it? What is it that made women of the 18th century so much more so much more motivated? I think it was Christianity, really.
You mean motivated like in the voluntary?
Like motivated as in like actually willing to have those six children in a log cabin, you know?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, the other thing that helped is they didn't really have very good contraception back then. That also
Yeah,
helped.
yeah, that's true. But I'm what I'm saying though is that like the they actually valued having that kind of family, and that's and the problem is that we don't have that anymore. And we just have no way of modern society just has no way of reproducing that appreciation for life, really, the reproduction of life. And
Well, yeah, because ultimately, it's in the family, which is the result of the reproduction and raising of new citizens. Society dies if you don't have that. That's the only method that has been proven over thousands of years to actually work in doing this. You can deviate from that norm to a degree for a time, but the forces that govern nature ultimately lash out against you and destroy your civilization.
Yeah. So yeah, another thing though is I know that you're debating Greg Johnson in a few months. Well, and I mean I'm a reactionary myself, so I'm in a lot of these right wing circles. And I'll often talk with fellow reactionaries, perhaps on the alt-right. A lot of them are not Christian, but what I say to them is that well, you won't be able to build a strong civilization on modern morals. I mean, I mean, even if you had your ethno state, you would need something to perpetuate it, and without a moral system, you won't be able to do that.
Well, exactly. So throughout Western Europe, throughout European history, beginning with around the time of Constantine, and then more specifically in the era of the scientific development of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the phrase "doing this for the sake of the white ethno state" said nobody ever.
Well, yeah, because you have to understand that what I always say is that, well, the white man stopped. I think that kind of the real problem we're facing is that the white man just stopped being great when he just lost his faith, when he started to just let his civilization fall away. I mean, this never would have happened had he never lost that. So the real dilemma, I mean, it started off with a fault that we had made, and I believe it's kind of just losing faith and just losing that appreciation for both God and appreciation for your nation. I think that's what really has caused the problem.
Well, so to go off that, one thing is those people in the West, when they did these great things like build hospitals, build universities, build orphanages, discover scientific theories, or write music, they did it for the same reason that Handel did. Handel would, at the end of all of his musical sheets, write "Sola Deo Gloria," for the glory of God alone. And so that's what those people were doing. That's what motivated the Benedictines to build universities. That's what motivated Basel to build hospitals. That's what motivated, people like Handel and Bach and the rest to make music, and what motivated the scientists like Newton and Copernicus and Kepler and Maxwell to do science. I mean, that is what Western man was aspiring to.
Yeah, and Newton actually wrote more about theology than he did science.
I know that's again part of the fake history of the atheists they trot out. But the point is, when Western because people can point and say, oh, well, Western man did okay when they're pagan. Well, okay, they had no hospitals, no universities, no scientific development for 3,000 years. Yeah, okay, great. I mean, Rodney Stark points out, probably somewhat hyperbolically, that, between, the rise of Rome and the fall of Rome, nothing was really developed. So maybe concrete.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean,
that's a bit hyperbolic, but
yeah, I will give the pagans credit for. I will give pagans credit for their developments, because I do think they had plenty. But another thing you have to point out though is the pagans were not atheists. I mean, it wasn't Christianity, but they did have a religion, and even their civilization, their ethos is so much stronger than modern secularism.
Oh yeah, totally. But I'm speaking more in the case of the alt-right, because they tend to, they want a spirituality. They tend to revert back to some sort of paganism, with the current favorite being the Norse religions.
Well, I mean, I'm also a nationalist. But what I say to my fellow nationalists is, I'll say to them is, we can't have a civilization that's unable to perpetuate itself. It won't matter it won't matter, what who you have in your state if your state can't survive. Like, so even these countries that in Europe that even if the threat of Islam went away tomorrow, Europe would still die. It's because the way that they live now is weak and unsustainable. Yeah, I think my another guy I spoke with, his name's Cato. What he said was that the current West, it's not a matter of if, but who will be the barbarians that burn down Rome at this rate.
Well, yeah. The other problem too is, will it be a society worth living in if it's just say you have a white ethno state tomorrow, but all the other pathologies of white people? Because societies that aren't worth living in are societies people don't die defending.
Exactly, and the problem is that I mean, these European states were entirely white states, but then they didn't defend them because they were no longer worth living in, because I think that it's because the people lost their beliefs.
Yeah, well, one of the key moments in this sort of loss of faith is really the two world wars, because right, you have this narrative beginning in the 19th century that upward and onward scientific progress, and we're all going to be better people. And back in those days, scientific progress was synonymous with Christianity, unlike today. But what happened was they got a really nasty reality check in two world wars, and it was just so destructive, so bad, that people just lost hope in the whole project.
Yeah, and yeah, a lot of people on the kind of dissident right have said that that's kind of where Western man lost his spirituality, he lost his belief in his civilization. And really, I think that we need to restore something like that if we're actually going to save our civilizations from falling apart. We need to restore our belief in that our civilization is something worth defending. And I feel like Christianity gives you that motivation.
Yeah, well, yeah, it does. But the real problem right now, especially in Europe, is that Christianity just isn't really on the table for a lot of people. They've been, part of it's brainwashing, part of it's their own sensual desires and not wanting to be accountable to anyone, and some of it's also ignorance. So a combination of all three. But now we do see positive change in Poland and Hungary, so maybe that can be an inspiration to other Europeans. But
yeah, but still, but I mean, the question remains though, like, we can build border fences, we can build all this stuff, and I mean, I think that, yeah, the demographics right now, that's the immediate threat. However, we also need something that even if that threat is even dealt with, the West needs something that'll keep it going beyond that, so that this doesn't happen again. Because it wasn't something that the West allowed this to happen to itself, and that's what needs to be prevented.
We allowed it to happen because, again, we turned away from. Well, I mean, again, what we're seeing now has occurred again and again and again in the Old Testament with Israel. When Israel would turn to God, they would prosper, they would be safe, they would be secure, and then they turned away. And they'd be conquered by Midianites, Canaanites, Philistines, and ultimately the Babylonians and Assyrians. And this is what's happening to the West. We've turned away from God, we've turned away from what made us great, and we're paying the price. See, the future is patriarchy. Is it going to be a pagan patriarchy like we see in Mexico with the cartels? Is it going to be an Islamic patriarchy, or is it going to be a Christian patriarchy? It's not. Patriarchy is the future. That's just already set in stone. Is what kind of patriarchy is it going to be? And I think every right-minded person doesn't want a pagan or Islamic patriarchy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one of the real like I said earlier, one of the real problems is that out of decadence, we've really kind of had this idea drilled into our head that that our individual comfort is really the most important thing of a civilization. I'm going to be talking about this in my next couple videos, which is why like you'll see you'll always hear these politicians talk about like women's empowerment. We need to get more women in leadership roles, and I mean that's not going to when Islam takes over, they're not going to care about that stuff, and
No.
What really matters is actually being able to build a sustainable civilization. And you're going to need women to be mothers if you're going to have that, because you're going to need, someone to inherit that,
Oh yeah. I mean, if there's no one to inherit it, then what's the use of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, yeah, what I'd say that moving forward, I think really the focus for Christians right now, what we need to focus on is fixing the church, because another thing we can talk about is, a lot of people are Christian, but in name only, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, totally. There are lots of people that are just Christian and in name only. And again, it's that old adage, right? First, get your house in order, or to quote Christ, don't pull the speck out of your brother's eye when there's a log in your own. First, pull the log out so you can see clearly. Then you can pull out the speck in your brother's eye. So it's that kind of idea. You can't judge rightly the world and what's going on around you until you first cleaned yourself up so you can see clearly.
Yeah, because one of the real problems is that a lot of these churches today, they've essentially given into progressivism. So they've given up pretty much every belief they've ever had, because they're just trying to like appear politically correct to the mainstream.
Yeah, totally. And again, that never works. I mean, appeasing the left and the mainstream always fails. I mean, Sun Tzu says never fight the enemy on their own terms.
Exactly. I've spoken about that quite often in some of my videos. And I think I think that a lot of these churches are going to need to just like kind of die in order to actually get real conservative Christianity back, because the problem is that you'll see with a lot of these churches is that their attendees are all like in their 70s. They'll have like a rainbow flag out front. They'll talk about like multiculturalism and diversity and all this nonsense. And and no one wants to attend these things. And they just eventually fall over and die, because no one wants to have this watered down version of their faith, really.
Yeah, I mean, if it's just a country club, you can get that in a secular point of view.
Uh-huh.
Without the guilt trip on morality,
mm-hmm.
From that perspective.
So yeah, I think that in order to actually get Christianity back to being a force in the culture, I think that there needs to be a reassertion of orthodoxy.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, because there's so much even just false teaching in the church. The idea that God is this tolerant, sort of indulgent father who winks at sin. That men and women are equal. It's just laughable. I mean, and yet all these views are so entrenched. But again, we have recourse for this, right? Because you look at right before Saul was selected as king. Samuel's own sons were wicked men that would take bribes and sleep with prostitutes, and Israel did what was right in its own eyes. So I mean, I think basically, if you want to look at how to turn this around, look at what worked in the Old Testament. How did Israel turn around in those moments when it was destroying itself?
Mm-hmm. And one thing is, I mean, I actually was an atheist till I was 19. And if you actually want to get younger people involved in church, you have to offer them something different that progressive culture doesn't offer them. And I think that one of those things is like offering them like a morality, really, because the reason I really despise all these liberal churches is because they're not telling people that they have to change anything. They're telling them that oh, you can just be comfortable in your sinful life, and you don't need to change anything. God loves you no matter what. Well, I mean, he does, but like he does, Christ said, "Go and sin no more." He didn't say, well, okay. He didn't come as a license to sin.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what Paul explicitly warns against, right? Grace is not a mask for license, even though out of evil grace abounds. That's not any reason for us to pursue evil.
Yeah. So it is a challenge institutionally to actually get conservative churches again, because they are politically incorrect these days. But if you do get a conservative church, they do grow much faster. Like they have a study in Canada that they said that conservative churches were growing at a rapid rate, but all these liberal churches were falling over and dying.
Exactly.
And it was almost without exception.
Well, not only that, so like when a thing like Vox will say the death of white Christian America, I mean, that's just bollocks. I mean, evangelicals are growing by leaps and bounds. They're actually having children. So, but what they're talking about are the mainline churches. In that narrow sense, yes, they're correct. But that's not even half the picture.
Oh yeah, the mainline churches are pathetic these days. But yeah, I mean, if it weren't for immigration numbers, then America would eventually be ruled by the Mormons and the evangelicals.
Yeah, the Mormons and the evangelicals. The evangelicals take east of the Mississippi, and the Mormons take the west. And no, but yeah, because those are the two indigenous groups having children. Now, the other group is having a fair amount of children, but even this has been exaggerated, the Latinos. But that's been exaggerated because in his book, The Empty Cradle, Philip Longman points out that due to global population reduction initiatives, oftentimes the World Bank and such will say, hey, look, unless you let Planned Parenthood, we won't give you any loans. Latin America's population is plummeting. Mexico's TFR went from like 7 in 1960 to 2.19 today, and it's still going down. So it's barely at replacement level, and it's still going down. So, eventually there'll be a day when the Mexicans just aren't coming over the border.
Yeah, but I mean, here's the problem though. Because if it weren't for the migration, in America, like I said, the Christian families, there might be fewer conservative Christians than there are secular people, but they have more children and they would produce more. And in Europe, it would be the same if it weren't for the migration. But however, the problem with Islam, though, is it's kind of the same situation where they're actually having more. Like I looked at the numbers in France. Now, France is not entirely credible because they don't actually take the statistics on who the people are. But what they estimated was that the average French woman only had 1.3, but the average Muslim woman had, I think, over 3. Meaning that, and then not only that, but the French population was on average 10 years older than the Muslim population, meaning that eventually, I mean, it would, in France, if things don't change, it'll be Islam that will take over.
Well, think about this. Here's what's not being talked about by people is that by 2100, with current trends, At worst, in places that are small countries like Austria and Switzerland, it'll be 20-25% Muslim, so 1/5 to 1/4. France and Germany 10 to 15%. But here's the thing:
it'll be higher than that. That's like within 30 years.
Well, what studies are you reading for that?
I got from that I saw Pew Research.
Really? Because in Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, Eric Kaufman, who published that book in 2010, makes predictions on the then current rate of immigration. And here's the thing: there is endogenous white growth in Europe due to Christians. You've got traditionalist Catholics in France. There's a Bible Belt in Holland full of hyper Calvinists. So those people are being ignored, and they have TFRs. In Holland, the Calvinist women have a TFR of like 3.5.
Yeah, that's pretty good. The problem is that these are minority populations, though. We have to understand that.
Well, as of now, Muslims are still minority populations.
No, but I mean the conservative Christians are too, though.
Well, that's the point. Yeah. But what I mean is, though, it's probably going to be those two duking it out rather than the secularists.
Yeah, I would agree.
That's what I'm saying.
Because the secularists are just going to fall over and die. The problem is, though, they're taking us down with them.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if we use an analogy, like the Christians in Europe are the healthy swimmers, and there's like a drowning man that doesn't know how to swim, and he's overweight, and he's trying to grab on us to stay afloat.
Exactly.
And that's sort of what's going on here. But we're about nearing the hour mark. Was there anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
Well, what I just want to say is that for my friends just in reactionary circles, what I just say is that the West is going to need something that's going to perpetuate itself, because the current threat that we're under, that one, if we're able to deal with it, which I understand that is an if, we're going to need something to sustain ourselves, meaning that we're going to need to have some kind of moral system, some kind of ethos, and something that's a strong civilizational force. And I believe that Christianity, we have the churches there, we have the institutions for it. It worked for thousands of years. If we can get conservative Christianity as a civilizational force again, I think that we can revive these dying civilizations.
I would agree with that. So thanks for coming on, Endeavor. This is
thanks for having me, Todd.
Yeah, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly Podcast, signing off.